In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how we feel from exploring the unknown and how we perceive the world.
You need to understand where intelligence fits in the trait hierarchy structure. And so we've looked at this before, but you can break the big five into the big two, plasticity and stability. We'll start with stability here. And stable people are conscientious, high in stress tolerance or emotional stability, or low in neuroticism, depending on how you look at it, and high in agreeableness. And then conscientiousness breaks down into industriousness and orderliness. Neuroticism breaks down into volatility and withdrawal, and agreeableness breaks down into politeness and compassion. And then for the second major trait, you have the big two trait, you have plasticity, and plasticity is made up of extroversion and openness, and those look like, the reason they clump together, the reason the first three clump together, we think, is because they're roughly associated with serotonergic function, and the reason the latter two clump together is because they're roughly associated with dopaminergic function, and the dopamine system mediates exploratory behavior in the face of the unknown, but it also mediates positive emotion. And it's because in order to move forward into the unknown, it isn't that you have to experience positive emotion, it's that the emotion you experience when you're motivated to move forward into the unknown and explore is a positive emotion. And positive emotion is very much also associated with interaction in the social environment. And maybe that's because a tremendous amount of what you're doing in the social environment is essentially exploratory behavior, right? Because, for example, when you're communicating with people, that's primarily exploratory behavior. So it's not surprising that the circuitry overlaps in that manner. Openness is the one we're going to concentrate on most particularly today. And it's openness to experience technically, and it seems to break down into intellect and openness proper, which is, it's intellect, which is interest in ideas, maybe facility with ideas, and openness, which is more like creativity. That's now, you can't divide them into interest in ideas and creativity so precisely because they overlap to a great degree. But there is reason for differentiating between them. So for example, women are about a third of a standard deviation higher than men in openness / creativity, and men are about a third of a standard deviation higher than women in interest in ideas and intellect. And that's actually quite a substantial difference within a trait that's, when the two traits are so highly correlated. So there's reason to do the fractionation. So anyways, so we're going to concentrate on openness today, and the reason that I'm presenting the trait description first rather than moving immediately into, say, IQ and creativity is because it's useful to know that you can take intelligence and put it in the big five taxonomy. And you can actually measure intelligence a lot more accurately with an IQ test, and perhaps also with a creativity test, than you can with the self-report personality test that relies on adjectives. You know, because I could ask you guys, well, how smart are you on a scale of 1 to 7? And that would be roughly correlated with your IQ. But if I really wanted to know how smart you were, roughly speaking, it would be much better to give you an IQ test. And if I was wanting to know how creative you are, rather than asking you how creative you are and getting you to report, even though there would be some accuracy in that, it would be better actually to give you some of the different tests of creativity that we'll talk about today. Now, the weird thing about the big five, or one of the weird things about it, is that we don't have great tests for the traits independently of self-report for almost all of the traits. So for example, one of the things that I've been trying to do in my lab for the last 5 years is to find some sort of laboratory task that conscientious people do better on or unconscientious people do worse on. And you'd think that would be simple because conscientiousness, for example, is a very good predictor of long-term life success. It's also a very good predictor of university grades. It's not as good as IQ, but it's still a good predictor. But we have had one insanely difficult time trying to find a non-self-report test that actually predicts conscientiousness. So, much appreciated. Yes. No, it's neuroticism. Neuroticism is associated with being more self-aware. And it loads on negative emotion. So being self-conscious is associated with being high in negative emotion. I mean, you can assess neuroticism using tests that that ask you about anxiety and emotional pain or depression, but that's also not much different than self-report. So the first thing that you might want to consider is that the world is a very complicated place. Now, we've talked about this before. And the way that you handle, there's way too much complexity for you to handle in its entirety. So for example, in a room like this, there's an endless number of phenomena that you could focus your attention on, right? From the sort of macro phenomena, which would be the overall, say, color or appearance of the room, to the micro phenomena, which would be the details at the highest level of detail that you're able to perceive that litter the landscape anywhere. And so one of the problems that you have to solve when you're operating in the world is how you perceive the world. And we do that in part by making, I would say that we perceive low resolution representations of the world, and we also confuse those with the world. So when I'm looking at you, I'm really looking at what I perceive consciously is a low resolution representation of you, right? I only see the front of you to begin with. I only see your surface. And in some sense, you know, I even perceive you in some sense as a more or less uniform color. It's hard to tell exactly what color skin is. It's sort of a light pink, roughly speaking. But my perception is fairly, I don't know a better way of putting it than low resolution. And I seem to perceive you at the level of resolution that's sufficient, the lowest resolution that's sufficient to facilitate our interactions, because I don't want to clutter up my perceptions of you when we're just talking with excess detail. So there's lots of things about you I don't need to see. I certainly can't see any of your microstructures below the phenomenal level. Like I can't tell without tremendous further investigation what you're made of biologically, for example. And I certainly can't perceive the networks of society that you're engaged in, your family or the other sorts of networks that you're embedded in. I see you here now, the front of you, at low resolution. And you can tell that to some degree, and we've talked about this before, because if you see, say, animated movies that use very low resolution representations of people, like South Park's a really good example, because the animation in South Park's very iconic and simple. It actually makes almost no difference to following the story. And so that shows you how iconic your perception really is. It can be replaced by very simple icons, and you instantly adapt to that. You know, and so we can go and see the Lego movie, the Batman Lego movie, for example, and the fact that it's Batman, which is an abstraction to begin with, and then it's made out of Legos, is almost irrelevant to following the plot. And so some people have compared our perceptions to the user interface on a computer. You know, when you're interacting with your computer, you don't really interact, so to speak, with the computer. There are iconic representations on the screen of the computer that you interact with, and those represent, obviously, they share some functional relationship with what's going on in the computer, but mostly they're there so that you, using your perceptual structures, can interact with the computer in a manner that's easy for extremely intelligent apes, roughly speaking. Now, so one of the problems that you have to solve in the world, because it's so full of detail and so complex, is how do you actually see the world? How do you actually perceive it? And it isn't really self-evident that that's a problem, because you think when you look at the world that it just presents itself to you. But it's a tremendously complicated problem, and that's partly why developing artificial intelligence systems that can actually see the world and act in it in any real way has proved to be a much more difficult problem than people had originally supposed. Because, you know, we were told maybe from the early 60s onwards that such things as speech to text or object recognition or robots that could operate in the world were only 2 or 3 years away. And well, I mean, we're in a situation now where there are some fairly complicated robots built, but they're still really in their nascent form. And it's because perceiving the world and then figuring out how to act in it turns out to be a much more complicated problem than we originally thought, because the borders between things are not self-evident, and what level of resolution you should be perceiving things at for, say, maximal functional utility is also not self-evident. It's also tied up very strangely and in ways we don't understand with the nature of your embodiment, you know. So, for example, we tend to see things that are handy because we can pick them up and manipulate them, and we can make use of them. And so to some degree, our brains are evolved to make the world manifest itself to us in a set of discrete usable tools.